time once again for Community Forum, and we are very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning John LaForge. John LaForge is co-director of Nukewatch. He is a regular contributor to Counterpunch and Truth Out, and co-editor of the revised edition of Nuclear Heartland, a guide to the 450 land-based missiles of the United States. So start out, tell us about Nukewatch.
We're a small nonprofit in northwest Wisconsin. We started in 1980 in Madison, moved out of there in 1996. We focus on the downside of nuclear power, nuclear weapons, and radiation accidents primarily. We publish a quarterly newsletter on these issues and report on the health hazards of radiation, nuclear weapons, and nuclear reactor accidents, and alternatives to these dangers.
And when did you get both involved with Nukewatch and involved in nuclear issues?
Oh, in 1979, it was a big year for me and for nuclear issues. 3 Mile Island, the partial meltdown in Pennsylvania happened. It's the same year that the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, invaded Afghanistan. And in response, then President Jimmy Carter reinstated draft registration. Those three things really lit a fire under the little peace group we had at a Minnesota college I was attending. And we started resisting nuclear weapons then.
So you have just recently, you are on tour. You spoke last night at the Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action, and we'll give details. You're going to be speaking this coming Monday at the University of Washington campus. But you are out and about, basically bringing to light the great book that you had published back in '88 originally.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
In the revised edition of Nuclear Heartland. Which at the time you've done an update to, it's just down to, I guess, 450 nuclear missile silos in the U.S. But at the time it was very groundbreaking with the maps and basically bringing to people this horrifying picture of these silos. And I just posted last night to friends on social media the map of Montana with just how many missiles are currently on Montana. It's phenomenal.
150 are still in silos on alert status, and the same for the Colorado, Nebraska, Wyoming field, which covers the corner of those three states where they meet, and then another 150 are in the North Dakota field, almost encircling the city of Minot. So the 450 altogether still.
So talk about what you see as the problems and issues with our current U.S. nuclear missile program.
Well, these weapons are archaic Cold War relics, and they're destabilizing in that they've over the years gotten more accurate than they need to be for retaliation. Accuracy in nuclear weapons is only necessary if you intend to hit the opponent's weapons or bases or command centers before anything's happened. Otherwise, the effects of nuclear weapons detonations are so enormous and overwhelming that you don't need any accuracy of any kind. If you're retaliating, or if you only need to threaten to do that to prevent an attack on us in the first place, accuracy is completely unnecessary. So these weapons destabilize and put the opponent on a hair trigger sort of launch on warning position, just as our weapons are, and just raise the risk of accidents. This has been true for a long time. Initially, when 1,000 of these Minuteman missiles were deployed across 6 states, or 6 missile fields in 7 states, and the book first came out, the public was basically unaware of the size of the nuclear arsenal and how near it is to regular homes and schools and communities. That was the shocking thing about the publication in 1988 of these maps, because they'd really never been made public before. They were known to county emergency management response teams and whatnot, and the Air Force itself, and to the Russians, who can see all these things on satellites. But the U.S. public was virtually unaware of the size of this nuclear arsenal. So there's been some progress since the publication in '88. Half of those weapons are now gone. The book produced a lot of protests in the missile fields. Hundreds of people walked right up to these places. Many went inside to protest and fight against the legal protection afforded nuclear weapons. You know, this country pretends nuclear weapons are lawful to use in warfare. A lot of nuclear weapon states play this same charade. However, we know that the commission of massacres is not lawful in warfare or any time. And that's all that nuclear weapons can do. So our argument is that they're not useful in warfare, they're destabilizing short of warfare, and they're such a colossal waste of money in view of the overwhelming size and power of our conventional military that they can be done away with without affecting the security or the military defensiveness of the United States. And this isn't just peace activists and religious leaders saying these things. Now, most recently, these land-based nuclear missiles, which can travel 6,000 miles, have been condemned by high-level military officials from all over the spectrum of political and military expertise, referring specifically to General James Cartwright, a former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so the second highest military official in the country. He was the chair of a major commission in 2012 that concluded that there's no sensible argument, this is the commission's language, that's been put forward for using nuclear weapons to solve any of the major 21st century problems we face. In fact, nuclear weapons have, on balance, arguably become more a part of the problem than any solution, end quote. The commission went on to suggest that eliminating the land-based nuclear weapons, these 450 Minuteman III missiles, would save $100 billion and would be, according to General Cartwright, the best option. Interestingly, then Senator Chuck Hagel was on this commission and signed off on this report. He later was nominated as Secretary of Defense, and when he went before the Senate Confirmation Committee hearing, he came up against these 10 senators in the missile silo fields who do everything they can, backflips and everything else, to protect these archaic weapons, who questioned him severely about signing on to this report. And he stuck to his position. He said we can get rid of the land-based missiles. And more recently, former Secretary of Defense William Perry, who was Secretary from 1994 to 97 under Bill Clinton, he's been even more adamant about getting rid of these particular weapons. He says, December 3rd last year, ICBMs aren't necessary, they're not needed. And he went on to warn that they're simply too easy to launch on bad information. And this is what we've been warning of for decades, that they're accident prone, and the accidents that they have caused are simply too dangerous to allow to continue. And this is William Perry just recently, September 30th, this year, in a major op-ed in the New York Times. He says these missiles are some of the most dangerous weapons in the world. The U.S. can safely phase out its land-based ICBM force. And he quotes several senators and House members who will write to the president, urging the president to back away from his plans to not only retain these missiles, but replace them with a brand new follow-on ICBM, which would cost, as Cartwright said, about $100 billion.
Is that part of the new $1 trillion upgrade that President Obama is currently proposing?
Yes, that's right. This $1 trillion project that Obama has proposed, of course, was explained as a quid pro quo to get the Senate to approve this New START treaty with Russia. It's a terrible program. It would bankrupt the country. $1 trillion is something, of course, the United States can't afford. And to replace plutonium pit production, nuclear warheads, that is, in Los Alamos, New Mexico, the uranium jacket, or the secondary that goes around hydrogen weapons, are supposedly going to be produced at the Y-12 plant in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And the third facility in Kansas City, called the Kansas City plant, which makes the non-nuclear components of nuclear weapons, that plant has already been completely replaced and is up and running. So this plan is going forward to rebuild the infrastructure and produce up to 80 new nuclear warheads a year. And this is preposterous when the rest of the world is clamoring for nuclear disarmament, and none of the nuclear weapons states can any longer afford the expense of maintaining and dealing with the waste that these weapons produce.
Well, and as you pointed out, we have so many times come so close to having serious accidents with these different weapons. Can you talk a little bit more about that, specifically with the missiles and missile silos?
Yeah, in the new book, we added 3 chapters, and one deals specifically with scandals and accidents that have plagued the missile silo system in the last 27 years. William Perry's piece on September 30th mentioned one incident that he was personally involved in. He's on a book tour promoting his book, My Journey at the Nuclear Brink, where he talks about how dangerous these weapons are, even in their modern, upgraded, and sophisticated state. He says, I was awakened in the middle of the night and told that some Defense Department computers were showing 200 ICBMs on the way from the Soviet Union. For one horrifying moment, I thought it was the end of civilization. The general on the phone explained that it was a false alarm. He was calling to see if I could help him determine what had gone wrong with the computer. This happens more frequently than people are aware, because oftentimes the accidents are covered up for months, if not years, before some stealthy reporter can dig it out. With the nuclear missiles, we've had situations where the launch control officers down in their underground launch control centers are given messages from the missiles themselves that they're undergoing their own launch sequence. And several times, Air Force security people have had to send heavy armored cars out to the silo and park them on the lid. In the event that the lid flies away to launch the missile, the truck will then fall into the silo and prevent the rocket from coming out. All these incidents have been false alarms, but nevertheless so scary that they've gone and parked these trucks on top of missile silo lids. It's hair-raising. More recently, just in May of 2015, a troubleshooting team was sent out to a missile in Montana, which was indicating some problem, and the team itself that went to troubleshoot caused an additional problem. This accident was covered up for months, unearthed by CBS News in January of this year. And the scandal just gets deeper and deeper. This thing was being dealt with in May of 2015, as I said, at the very same time that a high-level Pentagon delegation was out at this Air Force base investigating a drug distribution scandal among the missileers, as they call themselves, the people who work in the launch control centers ready to send these things off on the order of the president. You can imagine your 12-hour shift, 3 days at a time, underground, with nothing to do, 27 years after the end of the Cold War. This is probably the most tedious, the most boring job in the Air Force. And yet 7,600 missileers are still out there on duty, or that's the total actual missile system force. They're not all missile launch officers. But with this sort of tedium and relentless boredom, you can imagine the need for amphetamines. That's what happened. Some of these officers were selling amphetamine and ecstasy to one another. The investigation by the Air Force, an in-house investigation, has now expanded to 19 members of the missile force selling drugs to one another. Again, an indication of the dangerousness that we've established. We set ourselves up for a terrible accident. And it's not just a joking matter, although I do like to call it the nuclear war on drugs.
Well, it's a combination of incredible boredom and tedium combined with the stress and the underlying knowledge that, when you do press the button one of these days, it's not going to be a drill, and you're basically going to be, annihilating a large portion of the people on this planet.
Yeah, there does seem to be a growing awareness of the overwhelming explosive and destructive force of nuclear weapons, something that has been ignored ever since the end of the Cold War. That's another reason why we decided to do a second edition of the book. This is the first time we've gone back and readdressed this issue because after the Cold War came to an end, I think a lot of the American people got the mistaken impression that these weapons went away. Half of them did eventually go to retirement. The missiles themselves are sometimes reused by the space program. Warheads sent back to Pantex, Texas, where they're kept in bunkers unless they're rehabilitated, many of which have now gone back into use after being reconditioned and put on the Trident missile system, the submarine-based ballistic missile system. But they're still there, and that's why an international campaign has been generated with offices almost in every European capital now. The International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN.org, is just a great, relatively new organization of mostly young people pushing for a treaty ban at the United Nations that would forbid the manufacture, sale, and possession of nuclear weapons. And so I encourage people to check out their website, ican.org, has a lot of really great background information. Also, Nukewatch's website has these maps available so you can see where they are in your neck of the woods. That's nukewatchinfo.org. And if you would like to hear more about it, as you said, Mike, will be speaking on the subject of the new book Monday night at the university.
Yes, that's going to be happening Monday night at the University of Washington at the Hub at room 238 from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. So for those of you that want to check that out. One thing I know you touched on this, but in terms of the accidents that we have found out about, like, for instance, the one where they basically drove the vehicle on top of the silo in hopes that should the missile launch for real, that it would just slam into the vehicle and explode there and prevent it going much further. That whole incident was just from a reporter digging up info years after the fact. And in fact, all the emergency personnel and things like that you would think would be notified if there was an incident like this hadn't been at the time. Is that true?
Yeah, that's right. Interestingly, the reporter for the Casper, Wyoming Star, who dug this up, reported getting a lot of anonymous calls after the paper published her report telling her, oh, this happens all the time. So obviously, these things are a chronic problem. That is, the computer-generated misinformation about these weapons is a regular incident, a regular habit of these weapons. They're very complex. They're connected underground by cables that are subject to corrosion and cause a lot of problems. Over the years, these cables have been dug up and replaced over and over again. In North Dakota field in particular, there used to be two sets of 150 missiles, one in the east, one in the western part of North Dakota. When the Base Realignment and Closure Commission was tasked with the choice of deciding which of those two missile fields would be retired, they chose the Grand Forks missile field because, they said, it was subject to flooding more frequently than the Minot field. Of course, the Minot field was flooded severely in 2011 when the Souris River raged over its banks with a 500-year flood that was never supposed to happen. The city of Minot, 12,000 people was evacuated, and we put a photograph of the flooded mud hole missile on the cover of the book just to show people how dangerous these potential floods really are. And this was in the field that was supposedly drier than the field that was retired. So these accidents are chronic. They're a regular problem.
And aren't they doing major fracking operations like really close to the fields in Minot now?
Yes, that's a really great point, Mike. That's something that is hardly ever announced or reported in the press. The one newscaster that really dug into this was Rachel Maddow. So I recommend people check out her report on missiles and fracking, where she shows with about an 18-minute long investigation how close these fracking drill heads are to alert status thermonuclear weapons on in silos underground, right across, in some cases, a set of railroad tracks from one another. This goes in the what could go wrong file. It's more hair-raising than you can imagine, because fracking is a real inexact science. It causes a lot of problems. As you know, earthquakes are some of the consequences of this fracking campaign all over the country. There hasn't been an earthquake in North Dakota, happily, but there is a lot of movement of water underground that's caused and exacerbated by these explosions and by the smashing of these high-pressure chemicals into the ground. And that's a great report that Rachel Maddow did on her show about this risk that's being undertaken just in North Dakota for now.
I believe in Oklahoma they've had numerous quakes and a phenomenal increase in the number of quakes since they started fracking there just in the last several years. So it isn't unheard of for quakes to be occurring in regions where they are doing fracking.
That's
so
right.
We only got about 5 minutes left. So I want to get back to, you talked about that there's 10 key representatives that appear to be making sure that the money flows into their region, and that's why they appear primarily supportive of these land-based nuclear missiles. So what can people do to address that? And obviously the military industrial contractors that are reaping billions out of this whole deal.
Yeah, that's a good point. They call themselves, these 10 senators, the ICBM coalition. We like to call them the Doomsday Club. They are actually the single group that's now foiling these voices of reason, like General Cartwright, Secretary Perry, Secretary Hagel, who are calling for the elimination of the missiles. They, as you point out, senators from Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, Utah, and Louisiana, like the hundreds of millions of dollars that come into their state. They like the campaign contributions that are coming from Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and the other missile contractors. The senators, the Doomsday Lobby, foiled a 2012 Russian proposal to cut another 400 warheads from the arsenal. This was a straight-up offer from the Russians. Max Baucus, then from Montana, complained that the cut would have meant closing an entire missile base, and he said, "Probably mine," meaning the one near Malmstrom, Montana, as if that's his Air Force base. So they foiled that very reasonable effort by the Russians to cut another 400 warheads, simply because of the jobs, the votes, and the campaign contributions that come into their coffers. And this is a tiny group of U.S. senators. They can be foiled by the majority of the Senate. They need to be undone by these rational arguments that point out the danger and the redundancy of the missile system. Bill Hartung for the Center for Responsive Politics, he said these 10 people got at least $513,000 in the previous election cycle from GE, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, and United Technologies. So it's just a matter of political corruption that keeps these weapons alive. There is a campaign to address these particular senators and the rest of our elected representatives. You can see our petition to Congress to eliminate this weapon system on our website, Nukewatch Info. And please sign on to that petition and urge your, especially fiscally conservative representatives, to end this boondoggle and bring a halt to plans to replace the missiles and rebuild the nuclear weapons complex.
Do those 10 senators sit on any key committees that further allow them to keep the missile fund going?
That's a great question. I'm not sure of their committee status right now. I know some of them are on the Senate Armed Services, which is the committee that queried Chuck Hagel about his position on getting rid of these. But that's a little research project that your listeners might dig into. Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, Utah, and Louisiana. Oh, you might wonder, well, Utah and Louisiana don't have any missiles, but Utah has Hill Air Force Base. It's a giant facility that does the rehabilitation of these missiles when they are need of some updating. And Louisiana has the Barksdale Air Force Base, which is the U.S. operations headquarters for war in the Middle East. So when one of your Trident subs gets reconditioned for conventional warfare and its nuclear weapons are exchanged with conventional ones, and when there's talk of taking and putting conventional warheads on these ICBMs, Barksdale comes into play because some of these giant weapons might then be used in so-called conventional warfare in the Middle East.
All right, we are talking with John LaForge. He is co-director of Nukewatch and co-editor of the revised edition of Nuclear Heartland, a guide to the 450 land-based missiles of the United States. And if those of you who are listening would like to hear more, John is going to be speaking this coming Monday at on the University of Washington campus at the Hub, room 238, from 5:30 to 6:30. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Very good. And so you'll have slides and talk and plenty of time for Q&A,
right?
I would imagine.
Yes.
Very good. Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
Oh, my pleasure, Mike. Thanks for having me.